Alright, chat, should we talk about the fucking potential changes to old units? Let's open tier maker. That's a thing. It's incredibly sus. We know the league that says they're updating character models also hints at potential buffs to old units. So here's what we're gonna do, okay? We're gonna talk about units and buffs, right? That could use buffs, and we're gonna separate them in a bunch of different categories, right? There's gonna be needs buffs, should get buffed, could use buffs, should get buffed, weak, I guess bad, mid should get buffed, bad doesn't need buffs but could use them, mid doesn't need buffs but could use them, shouldn't get buffed. Alright, so first, we can talk about characters like Jean. I think characters like Jean should not get buffs. Jean has a pretty straightforward purpose, and I think she fulfills her purpose fairly well for what she does. Jean is not the sort of unit that is intended to be part of a main meta team. She's intended to be part of your early game progression if you lose your 50-50 to her. And so I don't think a unit like Jean, like obviously any unit could end up getting buffed if they want to buff them. But I think a unit like Jean is a good example of a unit that like definitely could get buffed, right? Isn't very strong, but where I don't see a buff as like actually important. I think she fulfills her role already. I also think it's important to realize that Hoyo keeps standard characters at a certain power level because they don't want you to be too happy losing your 50-50. Lisa, I don't really know where I'd put Lisa. Lisa's a sort of unit that I'd like to see buffs, but I doubt they would want to. I don't see them wanting to buff Lisa. Amber, I don't see them wanting to buff, and honestly, I think she's fine. She's a key that deals with a lock of enemies that require fast pyro hits, basically. I think that's her intended purpose for, like, the meta, like, the endgame meta. And her other intended purpose is, like, exploration and progression, and she already does that fine enough. And Noelle, I don't see getting buffed either. Barbara, I don't see getting buffed. Definitely don't buff Sucrose and Fischl. Mona, I don't think would get buffed. Okay, yeah, I mean, most of the 1.0 characters, I think the 1.0 4-stars, most of them I don't think would get buffed, right? And the standard ones, I also don't really expect buffs on either. Like the standard 5-stars. Venti, I don't know if it's better to give a direct buff to Venti's kit or to alter the content to make Venti relevant again. I'm not sure which one is better. Because the problem with Ventiable content is that when Venti's good, not having him feels so awful. You have to put in so much more work if you don't have Venti in content where Venti's actually good. And I honestly don't want content like that. So I think I'd rather see direct buffs to his kit. Or indirect buffs by giving him teammates that actually care about him. But I don't think that's really happening. Like, I would like it if Venti's energy refund talent also restored energy to Animo characters, and if they gave him Animo Shred in his kit. I think Venti should be a potential replacement for Farazan. I wouldn't give him a damage percent buff or a crit buff, but I would give him a similar amount of shred as Farazan. Because I'd like for there to be a reason not to use Farazan in Animo focus, like in Animo carry teams. I like for Animo carries to actively ask themselves the question, should I use Farazan or Venti? Would I rather have more damage with Farazan or a little bit less damage but still my shred at least with grouping with Venti? Wouldn't you just use both? If the only buff that Venti gives is Shred, then his buff is a lot less relevant if you already have Shred. So most likely you would not use Venti over another buffer. But I also just don't like how incredibly Farazan reliant Animo carries are. Because if you get unlucky on Farazan comms, you're just cooked as hell. Like, you can't play Shao. His teams are gonna suck. And having the option to pull Venti if you got unlucky on Farazan comms, I think would be nice. Me when I can't plunge on Shao because Venti's burst elevates them. Venti's burst doesn't last that long, so if you open with it, it's not a big deal. Alright, if you make it so that Venti's shred lasts for like 20 seconds, right? You open rotation with EQ on Venti, then you Farina EQ, then you Shanyan EQ, and then you swap to Xiao and Venti's burst is almost over, you EEQ, and then the burst is over. But yeah, that's the sort of buffs I'd like to see with Venti. Alright, Klee. I honestly don't think Klee needs buffs, but I don't think she couldn't use them either. Alright, I think she goes here. If I were to change anything about Klee, I would change her skill cooldown to 10 seconds and that's it. I wouldn't make off-field ult Klee. I I don't think our off-fielders need... I don't think Klee needs to be an off-fielder. Like, what you're saying is you just want another Xiangling. Like, I don't think that's necessary. We already have characters that apply off-field pyro. I think the most interesting part of Klee's kit is her skill, and I wish you could actually use it twice per rotation reliably. Child, make it C1 base kit, that doesn't change anything. Make it C4 base kit would change things. But I'm gonna be so for real. I feel like Child is a sort of character that is fine as is. Like, he's not good, but I don't think he needs to be good. Like, I don't think every character needs to be meta. And I don't know. I feel like Child's identity is just, it's not interesting enough for me to actively want him as an important part of the Genshin meta. If Molani didn't exist, I'd say there was more of a reason for Child to be present in the meta. But like, what does Child do that other characters don't? Riptides, yeah, but there's no AV content, so who cares? Apply a lot of Hydro. The thing is, he doesn't even apply that much. Unless you're in a heavy AoE, Singso's kind of just better. And he doesn't need to be on field. And he applies more Hydro. And if your purpose is, okay, well, Child should be the character that applies the most on-field Hydro, what does that achieve? More blooms? But what does more blooms do? It doesn't really do anything. Because of bloom and bloom like 2-hit limit. You could give him a proper like identity if you both like if you made it so that his C6 is part of base kit and increased his Hydro application as a character whose main purpose actually is Hydro application. But the problem is that even if you gave him really fast Hydro application without also giving him more uptime, he'll still apply less Hydro over rotation than a character that has full uptime like Singto. He's probably applying less Hydro than Ayato because of Ayato's burst having full uptime, right? So you'd need to both increase his application and rework his cooldown bullshit. But I feel like at that point, he's just a different unit altogether, right? Like that's just a full rework, that's not a buff. And to me, that's just kind of boring. He needs it. I mean, Child, Tatalia, Ajax is not a real person. He's a fictional character in a video game. He doesn't actually need anything, right? Like we're not actually talking about the fucking pyramid of needs of this fictional character, right? Like the clear implication is like, should this character get a buff? Like, not is this character in need of a buff in order to be good. Like, would it be good for the meta if Child got a buff, right? I think if you just increase his numbers, Child would just be more boring. I think it's impossible to increase his numbers in a way that would make him actually a meta carry in like Taser or Freeze teams without making his vape teams way too broken. And so if you just buff his numbers for the vape teams, he's just the same unit as he is now but slightly better. But he's a boring unit now. I feel like he's a sort of unit that in order to be an interesting character for the meta would actively need a rework, not just a numbers rebalance. And I don't think characters like that should get just numbers rebalance. Like just fucking give up on them and release a new character that has a reworked kit you were thinking about for Child. Maybe we can make a new category. Would need a rework or a buff really help? Like, we can add a new category for him. I don't mind. Sure. Just because he's boring to you doesn't mean he's boring to everyone. But here's the thing. When I say he's boring, what I mean is his team building role is inherently boring. Because the design of his kit is too clearly centered around the balance between being able to react as burst and work as a Hydro applicator for an off-field pyro damage dealer. And without a kit rework, you can't really change that. And I don't think Xiangling Slave is a kit that's interesting. I guess technically, if they nerf all of his numbers except the Riptide numbers, and they Omega buff the Riptide numbers, you could end up with a character that has actual, like, real quadratic scaling that would actually have a place where they could be balanced or, like, relatively weak in single target, but actually, like, the best character in the game in AoE. So maybe a buff like that could make him interesting with his current kit. But the endgame content we have right now is Siege and Onslaught. So that doesn't work. So who does deserve a buff? I mean, it's not, again, right? It's not whether or not they deserve it. They are not real people who end up in situations where they deserve or don't deserve good or bad things as a reward or punishment for what they've done. It's, would the meta become more interesting and more, like, interactive and fun if they got a buff? Anyways, next is Diona. I don't think Diona needs a buff. I think she's good where she is. They could give her a buff. They could. I think the only part of her kit that I feel kind of is there right now is shield duration. I think her shield should last a little bit longer. But that's kind of the only thing. Remove ICD from her charge attacks. Yeah, I guess that's true, but it's not like it would matter. Zhongli shouldn't get a buff. Zhongli is completely fine as he is. As much as I should talk Zhongli, and as much as I should talk to him over the years, Zhongli Zhongli is probably the character that has spent the most time on my teams when I was actively playing the game, Because anytime I go test something, if I don't want to have to bother with enemy attacks, the defensive utility option I use as my go-to is Zhongli. And there's a good reason for that. That's his role, really. He's a straightforward, don't have to think about it shielder that works in pretty much every team. That's his purpose, and I think he fulfills that role fairly well. I don't think a buff would really be necessary. I think his current place in the meta is very healthy. Xinyan, I don't think they would want to buff Xinyan, honestly. Albedo. Okay, chat. Honestly, in my opinion, there are two issues with Albedo's kit. One, the flower should not have HP, right? Like, flower getting destroyed because you put it inside an enemy hitbox is annoying, but I don't think it needs to be changed. I don't mind when a part of a character's kit requires skill to properly use. But Magu Kenki's fucking down slam attack destroying your flower because it kills it should not happen. That's a problem. Remove that shit. It getting destroyed by hitboxes, sure. It getting destroyed by damage, no. Take that out. That's the first thing I'd change. And the second thing I change is actually not this or this. The second thing I'd change is this. I would increase this number to 300. Why 300? Why not 200 or 400? 200 wouldn't be enough to make him all that good, and 400 would be too much. If you look at the teams where Albedo's used currently, right? Outside of the Geo teams, in which he's just worse than Chiori anyways, it's Melt Mawika. We got some double Geo stuff where he's like kind of sus anyways. Hyperbloom, Navia, I guess. Is there no Molani Sims with him? I'm actually surprised there's no Molani Sims with him. But I just really like the idea of Albedo the Alchemist as a reaction-focused Geo character. I don't know if 400 EM would be too much. Sucrose gives more and she's more flexible. Sucrose does not give more. Sucrose gives up to 230-ish. Do you run Instructor Albedo? I don't think so, but yeah. His personal damage isn't like insane, but it is enough to like that going for a 4-star set is kind of dumb, even if you were gonna put him on a support set. Or like even on a set that doesn't do any damage at all, right? I guess it's only 5k here, huh? Whatever. It is what it is. Well, I just think if Albedo actually gave a good amount of EM to the team, it fixes so many of his problems. Like, keep in mind, Crystallized Shields aren't that big, but when you have a lot of EM, they're not irrelevant either. Like, they actually start becoming significant, especially if you have a way to keep generating them, like you do with Albedo's skill. But yeah, like, personally, that's how I'd buff Albedo. And I think he should get buffed, and I think he's probably on the bad right now, so I would put him here. But yeah, really, like, you should have an EM scaling. I don't think he needs it. He could, but I don't think he needs it. Anyways, Ganyu, I think is fine as is. Chao, I think is fine as is. Futao, I think is fine as is. Rosario is definitely fine. Chao is not fine as is. His constellations are worse than diarrhea. I mean, they can rework his constellations. I don't give a fuck. Okay, I've talked about this before, but I wish they made it so that every time you reach a certain stack breakpoint on Erla, her burst explodes. And you keep the burst and you keep building it up, but it explodes for the current damage. And so, instead of being a 2% damage upgrade, it would be a 17% damage upgrade. And obviously, this probably would be a bit too strong, but maybe you make it so that it pulses for half of the current damage, right? So, right, it would make it about 12%. But the other cool thing is that it would also buff other sources of attack speed a lot. It would make Mika so much more relevant. That's one of the big problems with Endless Kit, is that the supports she has designed for her buff attack speed, her signature weapon buffs attack speed, and attack speed is dog shit on her. It's worthless as fuck. So not only would this buff make her a lot better, but it would also make it so that she has an identity that's special to her. Wanderer Scale's good with attack speed, sure, but not as good as this. So she'd be a Mika slave like Child of the Xiangling slave. I mean, if that's how you look at it, you're kind of just dumb. The reason I was calling Child of the Xiangling slave is not because Child's team would be reliant on Xiangling if you kept his kit exactly as is. It's because Child's team wouldn't really be Child teams. They're just Child being there where any other character that applies a lot of Hydro could replace him if they ended up getting released. Despite the increase in motion value on the attacks directly being 20%, it would be a 30% upgrade. I don't know. I just think something like this would be really cool, right? And they could balance the numbers so that she doesn't become broken, right? Like maybe just pulsing for current damage would be too good, because it would make her current teams almost triple her personal damage. It would be plus 50k, so 110k. So maybe that would be a little bit too good. I don't think they'd want to make it that good either, because then they wouldn't be able to sell other physical carries in the future. But yeah, so like if I were to buff Ella, this is what I'd do. And I do think that you can buff her in a way that makes her actively different from other future physical carries without reducing your design space for physical carries in the future. So I think she goes here as well. Kazuha doesn't need a buff. Ayaka, I don't think needs a buff. Yoimiya, bro, Yoimiya's cooked as hell, man. Well, how do you make her feel different? How do you buff Yoimiya while also giving her a unique identity that isn't just the same as other characters? I don't know if I really like the idea of just leaning into the attack speed synergy, because any range character could lean into that. And we already have characters, even including non-range characters, that do lean into that. And they lean into it better, like Skirk. Right, like without looking at her numbers, right? What identity does Yoimiya's kit evoke? Right, single target focus. She has a team buff. Can't react too much of her damage. Average application speed. Okay, you know what? Maybe this is what we should lean into. I guess that is still leaning into attack speed synergy, but I would remove the cap on this. I'd also change this from shots from Yoimiya's normal attacks to pyro damage. And I would, yeah. And so you could open with a charge attack with her like special charge attack thingy, and then immediately use the skill before the thingies hit, and you would get 3 stacks from the thingies. And then you'd also get stacks from the burst, which would make her burst feel more worth using. 6% power damage bonus on a character who doesn't do damage. I mean, it would be more than 6. Like, she would start with 6 more, and she would get another, like, about 8 or 10 from this over the duration. But also, the removal of the limit would make it so that, well, instead of capping out at 20, she wouldn't cap. So she'd get another, like, she'd get another, like, 20 from her normal attacks themselves. That's like 40-ish damage per. I guess it's not enough. I guess you also have to make the number bigger. Does this not just make her reverse Arlecchino? It does make her reverse Arlecchino. But I think I think that's fine. I think that's an interesting identity that already leans into her kit, but also makes a lot of sense because it would also make the C6 a lot better, right? Like, if that's how her kit worked, it would make it so that her constellations make more sense. Not just the C6, right? But also, actually no. Maybe change C1 for skill duration instead of burst duration. You think her burst should even be usable? Or that he's kind of that she's not burst reliant? I mean, that was a tailor-made set for her. I mean, is it really? Like, she's the character that uses it, but is it really a tailor-made set for her? Buffed by overloads? I mean, if it was any source of pyro damage, guess what elemental type overload damage is? So you can get even more damage if she's the trigger for overload. And make it 4% instead of 2. That gives her a unique identity, and it's not just attack speed synergy, right? Which was, like, what I didn't really want at the start, right? I don't want just attack speed synergy, because I feel like they can make other characters attack speed synergy. But the nice thing about this kit is that, well, the characters that give attack speed are not electro characters, right? So they don't enable you to get overloads. So the added attacks from the attack speed don't actually lead to more damage percent than triggering overload does. So it'll be fine. But yeah, I think that's what I would do for Yoimiya's kit. And one nice thing about all of this is that literally all you have to do is change a little bit of the words and the numbers here, right? You change shots from Yoimiya's normal attacks to pyro damage dealt by Yoimiya. You change 2% to like 4%, and you remove and can have a maximum of 10 stacks. Let's actually finalize my personal idea for a Venti kit redesign. I think his C2 should be part of his base kit. C2 in base kit. It could even be more than 24, right? It could be like 30, 35 maybe. I think Ascension 4 should also refund the energy for animal characters. And I think skill tap E increases burst duration by 2 seconds. And hold E increases burst duration by 4 seconds and brings black hole to ground. It'd be nice if you reduce the animation too, but I don't think that's as necessary. Or maybe, yeah, you put the black hole on the ground by default and you make the hold E make it go up instead. But no, nah, I think this is fine. Or maybe they should make it so the hold E doesn't make you go up. It creates a wind current, but then you can choose whether you take it or not. Like you still have to jump and glide to take it. But yeah, the reason why I would want something like this is because right now the biggest problem with Venti is that while he is the best at grouping, he's not even that much better than the other groupers because of his short burst duration. Like his burst is by far the best grouping ability in the game, but you have a decent amount of downtime on it, which is kind of annoying. And the other problem is that there's too much unreliability in the elemental absorption for this shit because of enemies having the potential to have innate elements. And unlike damage percent buff, energy buffs, when you don't get them, if you build with the assumption that you do, you won't have your burst and your team won't function. So you're gonna have to build enough energy that even without this, you still have enough energy, so it's not doing anything. I think it should unconditionally do something, and I think making it restore energy to animal characters by default, and then on top of that, whatever element gets absorbed, is a really good way to make it feel better to use. That also creates an actual real reason to put him on the team outside of just for the grouping. And if you also put the C2 in his base kit, there would actually be teams where he's a pretty solid option. But he still wouldn't beat Farazan for damage only. But he probably would be Farazan C0, which would be really healthy for the meta. Because Animal Carry's reliance on Farazan C6 is fucking cringe as hell. Of course, our characters being good is a good thing, but when they're C6 reliant and they're a lot worse without it, it introduces a pretty big amount of RNG in the power of your team. Because you have a lot less control over which 4 stars you get than which 5 stars you get. It does mean that you might end up getting C6 even if you don't go for a single one of the characters. Like, you might end up getting C6 just accidentally. It might cost you 0 wishes, literally, but it also might end up bringing you to a situation where you just don't have it and you don't have a good way to get it. Yeah, exactly. Like, I do not want to end up in a situation where Varka is bad if you don't have Farazan C6. And I feel like that's what's gonna happen if he's actually an Animo-focused carry. Right? At least with Wanderer and with Shao, because they're kind of dog shit, if you don't have Farazan, you can just pretend like they're doing something and get them wheelchaired. And the wheelchair teams are actually about as good as the carry teams. But if they were actually good, then the wheelchair teams would be a lot worse than the carry teams. Right, like if you don't have C6 Farazan but you want to play Wanderer because he's your favorite character, you can just do fucking Wanderer, Shilona, and Yelan for Rina or some shit, and you have a team that is strong enough to clear content, right? With content getting harder and harder, if stuff is balanced around Varka's teams with Farazan and you don't have Farazan, the wheelchair stuff probably won't be as good as the Farazan stuff, so you probably are going to end up struggling, which, I don't know. Yeah, I think that's definitely a potential problem that needs to be addressed. What is Shilonan doing in that team? She's giving Cinder City and Shred to your carries, Yelan and Farina, right? If you look at C0 Wanderer teams, it's actually the highest one. Don't look Wanderer build. Don't look team DPS. Like, earlier I talked about how if you really wanted to buff Child, you'd have to go with a rework, not just a numbers buff. But I didn't really give any ideas for a rework. We can think about that. What would I do if I was asked to rework Child's kit? Alright, like Hoyo sends me an email like today, and they say, "Hello, Zajef77, big fan. My name is John Hoyoverse, and I made Genshin Impact, and I was wondering actually if you had any ideas that that you would be willing to share with me to rework Child's kit and make him more relevant in the meta, more interesting. Looking forward to hearing back from you, John Hoyoverse." Alright, so say I received this email. What would I do? So, okay, let's look at Child's current kit. Let's look at all the shit he has. Let's look at what's good and what's not good. So, Riptide, as a whole, is bad. The problem with Riptide is that applying it is too trivial, and it makes it so that the trigger condition of you do this thing when enemies are affected by Riptide, when you use a charge attack, when you use a normal attack in the skill, when you use burst, whatever, it makes that effectively just, it always happens. There's no trigger condition. The trigger condition is too trivial. So you have two options. Either you just remove the trigger condition and make it always happen, or you make it so that some parts of his kit actually remove the Riptide, right? Like, technically this removes the Riptide, but because it's so easy to reapply it, it doesn't actually matter. I don't think this should exist. This passive should be removed entirely, right? Because this passive effectively actually reads, enemies always have Riptide when you're in melee form. I think there's two ways you could go about changing this. Either, one, keep a passive that does something extra on crits, but make it actually do something instead of just applying a Riptide on an enemy that already has obtained Riptide from your 83 different other sources of applying Riptide, right? So maybe it actually triggers one of the Riptide attacks whenever you crit in your skill on an enemy that has a Riptide mark. But don't give him a way to apply it. Or don't keep the like synergy on crit stuff and just make it so that this passive applies it at the start, like whatever. Or does something else entirely. Personally, what I would like to see out of Child's Kit is I'd like to see a kit that is incentivized to either do charge shots with one of your burst options or do melee normal attacks with the other burst option. How do you do that? Make it so that while he's in his skill, he doesn't have a way to apply Riptide, right? So if he uses his melee burst, he loses the Riptide and he can't reapply it. And so if you want to get the Riptide damage from his like normal attacks in the skill stance, you have to either use your range burst, because the range burst doesn't consume Riptide, it even applies Riptide, or finish your rotation with burst. But if you finish your rotation with burst, you can't vape it, so it's a lot worse. So you don't really want to do that, right? You could finish your rotation with melee burst, but it's not something you'd want to do. And that would make it so that if you want to use the melee burst and the reacted melee burst, you would react your melee burst, but then you'd swap back to the bow stance for Riptides. And you'd charge shots, you'd use charge shots as your main form of damage after your burst. And the only actual kit change that's required in order for this to work is to remove this passive and change it for something that doesn't apply Riptide. And then he naturally will end up leaning into that. And then you can rebalance the numbers to make him actually strong if you want and actually worth playing. But I think that's the only real kit change he would need for his mastery of different weapons to actually feel important. So he'd be a bow charge attack character like Linny. You'd get to choose. You could either have him as a bow charge attack character like Linny with a nuke on melee burst, or you could have him as a melee character focused on applying hydro with the range burst. Sounds a bit like Skirk. It's not exactly like Skirk, because in both stance options, he's a non-fielder. It's just that in one of the stance options, he's a bow user, and in the other one, he's not. And I think that they should make it so that instead of Riptide Blast, the like melee skill, or actually remove the melee skill damage and add all of this damage into Riptide Blast and make it even bigger than this. And then in AoE, it could double hit, which would be so cool. And same thing here, Riptide Flash should just do a lot more. That's probably what I would do if I was asked to rework Child. Would 7 Flower Albedo be a good carry? I think so, yeah. Let's calc it. Yeah, he'd be pretty fucking good, actually. Yeah, he'd be pretty fucking good, actually. What is the first rotation DPS? We don't talk about that. We don't talk about that. 25k. We don't talk about that, okay? Play 18-second rotation when it's 20 because of Farina. This is a rotation that has a lot of rotational flexibility. You just swap to Farina to skill without it being part of your main rotation. I mean, we could just fucking make it so you get 8 procs. Or sorry, you get 9 procs instead of 8. And it lasts for 20 seconds. Basically the same shit. Like, whatever. Ironically, good but not broken. No, this is broken. Because, like, you gotta keep in mind, you also have Farina and Yelan personal damage. So the team DPS is at, like, 130k. Yelan ain't doing shit for the team, right? So as soon as we get a replacement for Yelan that actually does something, the team gets even better.
I think it'd be fun if that was a copy of Albedo himself, as that's very fitting for his lore.
I mean, it does make sense, right? Like, for his lore, to have a kid based around creating life. But I don't think it's a good idea to spawn entities that work like allied entities do. Because allied entities are so fucking awful. They're so buggy and cringe, and I don't want that as part of Albedo's base gameplay loop. Like, no, please no. What they could do, if you want to focus on creating life, is you could create a homunculus version of an enemy that is stationary and that doesn't actually do anything, but you can trigger reactions on them. You can double your swirl damage, your superconduct damage in single target. You can double your bloom damage in single target and add that onto my previously mentioned idea of increasing the EM buff from his Ascension passive. And it actually makes him the sort of character that you would actively want to use in reaction teams, which makes a lot of sense for an alchemist, while also having a life creation aspect. I'm talking myself into thinking that's an amazing kit, by the way. Yeah, that would be Omega banger. What the fuck? That would be so fucking banger. Holy. Albedo better bloom support than Nilo. True. That's how things should be. True, wait. And you could use his burst to create a test dummy when you want to test stuff. Wait, that's so true, actually. What the hell? So true. Yeah, that's we figured out the best way to rework Albedo. That is 100% what it should be. I actually don't think Mona's kit needs changes. I think Mona's kit is completely fine as is. Okay, actually though, one thing I think Mona should have is I don't think Mona's skill should pop the Omen. Because Omen duration ends up being practically always lower than what it should be because it gets popped by Mona's own ability if you EQ. And if you don't EQ, you're not proccing the 5 that you fucking need to have on her anyways. Sayu, Sayu doesn't really, like, whatever. Sayu's Sayu. It is what it is. Raiden. Okay, chat. I think Raiden is fine as is. I don't think she's the sort of character that really needs changes. Like, sure, you could buff her, but I think she's completely fine. Next thing you're gonna say Ayato is fine? I mean, we're not at Ayato yet. The next thing I'm gonna say Sarah is... mid should get buffed, actually. Make her things last longer. I don't even think that's the problem. Just remove the fucking charge attack and make the skill do everything by itself. And maybe increase the AoE of the self buff. How do you interpret buffing? Well, it's just because there was a leak that they're supposedly going to be buffing some of the old characters. Like, rebalancing some of them. And, like, I think there's some characters that are bad that are gonna stay bad that they would never consider buffing because they're not really intended to be good. Alright, characters like Kutsing, for example, I don't think are ever gonna get changed. But there are also characters that I think actually could end up getting buffed. I think the buff is just the clothes. I mean, they said there were some model redesign and some buffs. There wouldn't be an end if there were no kit buffs. But it might just be a fucking lie, right? Don't get me wrong. Don't use me as a source for oh my god, Hoyo confirmed going to buff. Like, no. But anyways. Alright, Kokomi. No. Kokomi goes in the shouldn't get buffed. Aloy goes in the wouldn't get buffed. Toma's fine. Ito is the sort of character that would get buffed. 100%. Like, Ito actively needs a direct buff to not be completely worthless. Like, they could give Ito 50% more damage and he still wouldn't be meta. Doesn't that mean he needs a rework? No, because the problem is his numbers. His kit is actually pretty cool. The problem is that the numbers are so low that they would need a major buff. But also, I don't think they want any of these characters to actually become meta. I don't think they want any of these characters to be on the same level as Malika. I don't think they want them to be on the same level as Verissa either. I think at best, if they do end up buffing characters, they'll buff them up to the level of, like, Ayato. Maybe a little bit higher than that. Up to the level of, like, Raiden. That's why I don't think Raiden's gonna, like, that's why I don't think I wouldn't really see Raiden getting a buff, because, like, the level of Raiden is basically where I would expect the characters to get buffed up to. You'd only buff the dog shit characters. I mean, characters that are already meta, I would not buff, yeah. But I also think that characters that should get buffed are characters that are actively different in a noticeable way from current meta characters, and the ways they get buffed should emphasize those differences, right? That's why when I talked about Albedo, the buff I suggested was a buff to the EM sharing he has. I think if you just buff his all-field damage, it just makes him even more like Chiori, and I don't see that happening. That's why when I talked about Yoimiya, I talked about going all in on her Ascension passive that gives her power damage when she hits things. Make the number on it higher, and remove the stack limit. That actually makes her feel incredibly different. The exact opposite of Arlecchino. Because, like, right now, Yoimiya is just bad Arlecchino. Like, dog shit Arlecchino. But if you make her a character that gets stronger the more you attack with her, you effectively give her the reverse damage profile that Arlecchino has, and you're also making it so that she inherently synergizes with things that work differently. Arlecchino has awful synergy with attack speed, because getting more attacks just gives you more attacks at low bond of life, and makes you, like, run out of bond of life faster, so it's not actually good. Getting attack speed on Yoimiya, if you remove the stack limit and made the number on it higher, actively means that she gets more damage percent from this passive. Arlecchino in overload teams doesn't really need to be the trigger, and you, in a lot of the overload teams, you have your electro unit as a trigger instead. Alright, you have, like, EM Raiden as an option, for example. If you use the idea that I had of making it so that this works on every source of pyro damage, not just normal attacks, you could make it work for overloads too, and which would give you an even stronger incentive to make sure that Yoimiya is the character triggering overload, not your electro character, right? So, like, yes, they would both be normal attack focused pyro carries, but the way ways they would function with buffs and with like just teams in general would be incredibly distinct from one another, right? I think if all they did was just double Yoimiya's numbers, she wouldn't feel any like she'd be stronger, but she'd be the same type of character, and I just don't see them doing something like that. I don't see them ever just buffing up Yoimiya so that she, instead of feeling like Arlecchino from Wish, she feels like Arlecchino from Walmart. Like I think if they want to make Yoimiya a more meta-relevant character, they have to lean into something she does differently from other characters. That's also why I suggested that Ella start pulsing with like half of the current stacked burst damage every time, or every time she gains 2 stacks. Makes her synergize with attack speed. Makes her heavily rewarded for getting your actual upper limit of stacks and heavily punished for missing a stack. Makes her damage profile a lot more consistent so that even if the enemy dodges the burst at the end, you still get most of it. It fixes all of her issues while also making her feel very different from any other physical carry we have right now, even though they're bad, but also without taking away from potential design space for physical carries in the future, right? She would inherently be a character that synergizes with attack speed way better than every other stat if that's the kit you made, and so you could still release physical carries that don't synergize with attack speed and make them strong without them just being power creep to Ella or being worse than her. Like, make them actually distinct. And with Venti, it's a little bit different because Venti doesn't have an identity, or Venti already has an identity and he is already the best at his identity, but because Hoyo doesn't give us content that focuses on that identity anymore, and because Venti's an Archon, I think it would be nice if he was at least viable outside of his niche. They could also fix Venti by just reintroducing Ventiable content, but I don't think they're gonna do that. Anyways, Goro, I don't see them changing Goro, honestly. Shenhe is a sort of character that, like, balance-wise isn't that good, but she doesn't have any competition, so she's still viable. I don't think they'd change her numbers. Yunjin, and I would like Yunjin to get buffs. I don't think they would, but I would really, really like for her to get buffs. Make her null burst reliant? Don't think that's a good idea. I think her kit is completely fine. I wish her numbers weren't complete dog shit, basically. Make her C2 and C6 stronger? No. Just like triple the scaling on her burst. She wouldn't even be that good even if you did. Yai. I think Yai is at the lower limit of balance where I don't think they'd buff her. Kind of like Ayato. They would not buff Uznari. Well, doesn't need a buff. Tori doesn't need a buff. Sino. I could see Sino getting buffed. Okay, I'm gonna be honest. I think it depends on Flynn's kit. If Flynn's is an EM scaler, I don't think Sino would ever get buffed. But if Flynn's is not an EM scaler, I feel like they could like significantly increase the EM scaling on Sino's kit and change him into an actual EM scaler instead of an attack scaler. Raiden being in the shouldn't/wouldn't get buffed tier is wild. Bad take. I mean, I think she's good enough now. Isn't her only team Hyper Blue? I mean, sure, but it's a pretty good team. Yeah, like, if you want me to put Raiden here, sure. I don't really give a shit. It's just like, how do you buff Raiden without just making her exactly the same as the other Electro carries? Like, just increase her numbers? Okay, congrats. You now have a character that's like just Klein, but also but from Inazuma. Or you have a character that's Veresa, but from Inazuma, depending on how much you buff her. Like, I don't think she's distinct enough from the other Electro carries to warrant a situation where you would want to buff her and she wouldn't just become the same thing as something you already have. I don't think any of these characters should be buffed unless they're introduced into new teams, or at the very least, the teams that they would be using, that they're already using, are like team cores that you're not already using on meta characters right now. Improve her ER scaling, and what does that change? It just it might change your subset priority, but does it actually change her team building? No. Does it actually change the way her teams play? No. All you're changing is the numbers on your stat screen. You're not actually changing anything about the gameplay. So I don't think that's a good idea. Make her buff burst damage for other characters based on her own ER. That is a way you could actually make her feel different. But if you buff that enough for it to be a strong meta team, you're limiting future design space. You're making it impossible to make strong burst focused characters that are off field, which is a different problem, but a problem nonetheless. Reduce the duration of her burst, like get the burst, all the damage from the burst out in a shorter time window. Is that what you're saying? I mean, that's something you could consider, but in order to reduce it to the point where you would actually consider her as a last spot with pyro carries, I think you would have to change it so much that it would effectively be a rework. So then she'd be in this category instead. I'm a lot more comfortable putting Raiden in this category than this one, honestly. Why can't old units outshine new ones in certain aspects? That's not the problem here. The problem is if you just all you do with Raiden is you buff her damage numbers so that she does as much damage as Client, then what is the difference between playing Raiden and playing Client? Realistically, actually kind of, there isn't a difference. I don't want a character to just be the same thing as another character. If you're gonna make them as powerful, make them as powerful through doing something different, not through doing something that's the same. Otherwise, that's boring. What's the difference between playing Klein and playing Verissa? Team building wise, Verissa's a good character. You're right. Like, you're thinking about it the right way. If Verissa was balanced to be the same level as Klein, team building wise, she'd be kind of fucking boring. Gameplay wise, there's still a difference, but I don't think gameplay wise, like, gameplay difference is enough to really justify a buff. I don't really want there to be multiple characters that are interchangeable in the carry slots in your teams. I think that's boring. I think each character should have their own identity, each carry at least. There is actual difference with Verissa, by the way, where Verissa can actually swap out whenever, which gives you more flexibility, but we don't really have the teammates to make that matter, right? But that's at least design space for the future. Pyro carries that need to be swapped into can work better with Verissa than they would with Klein. And Verissa also works a lot better with Bennett than Klein does. But like, you're kind of right that they're not that different, and that if Klein's numbers were balanced to be as good as Verissa's numbers, Verissa would have been kind of a fucking throwaway character and kind of a boring one. That's hypocrisy. Just because X isn't that distinct from Y gameplay wise doesn't mean X shouldn't be as good as Y numbers wise. I mean, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that releasing a character with certain numbers and buffing an old character's numbers are inherently very different actions. I think if you're gonna buff a character, and with the knowledge that they're not gonna buff every old character, I would much rather you focus on the characters that do something different instead of the characters that do something that's the same. Maybe changing Ride and Burst and not use the entire energy, make it depend on the time you spend on Burst, and if you swap out early, your cooldown is lower, meaning you can use it multiple times. That could be a really interesting one. Yeah, I like that. Remove Ride and Burst cooldown and make it so that the initial slash costs half of your energy, like half of total energy, and then the attacks you do after the initial slash cost the rest. So if you have a lot of particle generation, you can use her burst, swap out to do shit on your other characters, and then swap back to Ride and use burst again, swap out, do shit on your other characters, back to Ride and burst again. That's a kit redesign that actually would be really interesting, which would effectively keep the same abilities on her while actually giving her a different identity. I like Sethos. Yeah, but I think it would be different enough from Sethos since it's like quick swap focused gameplay that plays with energy instead of like carry focused gameplay that plays with energy. Wouldn't that just be Verissa? Not really. Verissa doesn't scale linearly with energy. You're gated by your skill cooldown for her mini burst. Even though the mini burst itself doesn't have cooldown, you're still actually gated by skill cooldown and relatively long skill animations. My idea of this version of a Raiden rework would have no gate other than the energy itself. So if you have a lot of energy recharge on her, or a lot of energy particle generation, you'd be able to use her bursts proportionally more based on that amount of energy. Like, that would be a cool Raiden kit redesign. That's what that I would like to see. It would also actually go all in on her ER scaling, because right now her ER scaling is nice, but like, once you have enough ER, you don't want more, right? Like, you'd still rather have attack over ER if you have enough energy to burst. But if enough energy to burst was not a static breakpoint, but rather more energy just meant more bursts, then you would much rather go ER Sands. And it would heavily incentivize going ER Sands on ER weapon with a lot of ER substats as well, which would change the way that you build her in an actually interesting way too. Would Fav be her best weapon over Sig? Probably not over Sig. Sig gives a lot of energy, but Fav would probably be better than Catch, yeah. But then you also have to keep in mind that her burst has an animation, so more burst does mean more damage from burst, but it also means more time spent on her instead of your other characters. In order to burst every time you get the energy for it, you would need to be playing her with other characters that can afford to be swapped out of, like Arlecchino. Right? She wouldn't work really well with Moika. She wouldn't work really well with Yuemiya. She wouldn't work really well with, I don't know who else. Anyways, he'd probably also get less resolve, I guess. I feel like you probably don't want to lean into the resolve stuff too much, though. Like, maybe instead of consuming all of your resolve, it just consumes half of it instead when you burst. Like, the same thing as your energy, right? You consume half of your resolve when you burst, and you consume more if you keep attacking after that. Wouldn't that make EMC insane for her? Yeah. EMC revival arc, true. And by the way, like, that's why I'm comfortable putting Sino here. Because, like, Sino already has an aspect of his kit that separates him from other Electro characters with his EMC. scaling. Technically, Sethos also has EM scaling, but Sethos also has a lot of things that make him different. So I think I think Cyno's different from him enough. Anyways, Candace. They're not gonna buff the 4 stars. Let's be so for real right now. Nilo. I don't think they would directly buff Nilo. Nilo's a sort of character that can get massive indirect buffs from the release of supports that work with her. I don't think Nilo's the sort of character that would ever get direct buffs. Yeah, like we know Llama's coming. I know Columbina. Like Nilo will get buffs indirectly. Nahida wouldn't get buffed. Lila wouldn't get buffed. Wanderer. I don't think they'd buff Wanderer because we know Varka's coming, and I feel like if you made Wanderer good enough to be meta, you're taking away too much design space for Animo carries. I expect Varka's kit to basically just be another like full Animo damage focused on either normal, charge, plunge, whatever. Only Shao gets buffs. I also put Shao in this. That's a failure of imagination. I mean, no cards. What then? Okay, Mr. fucking Bob Ross. With the amazing imagination. What's your recommendation for buffing Wander in a way that makes him distinct without taking away from Varka design space? Make the dash stronger, and what does that do? You just dash more, okay. So what? The button you input becomes different, but the team building and the base gameplay loop doesn't change. So that's not really different. Play more with elemental absorption mechanics. I guess you could do that. That's true. That's just Chaska? No. Chaska's absorption makes her change her damage types, right? Wanderer's absorption gives him buffs based on the elements he gets. They work inherently quite differently from one another. If you lean more into the elemental absorption stuff for Wanderer, it wouldn't make him a non-Animo carry. He'd still be an Animo carry who does only Animo damage, but it might change the way you want to build his teams. That's actually a good way you could go about it. Okay, yeah, I'm convinced. Let's put him here. I think you keep the Pyro buff as it is, you keep the Hydro buff as it is, but you Omega buff the Electro and the Cryo one. The Hydro buff sucks ass, that's fine. The reason why I would not buff the Pyro one or the Hydro one isn't because they're already very strong. It's because default random Animo character that's a carry that you play with Farazan wants to be played with Bennett and Farina. That's the case if you're looking at like Wanderer teams for Wanderer, and it'll be the case for Varka. And so the main way you can make Wanderer feel different from Varka is by giving him a strong incentive to be played with different units. And that's something that you do by Omega buffing the Electro and the Cryo one. Make it so that the Electro one, when he gets it, his burst cooldown becomes 2 seconds and his burst cost becomes 10. Make it so the Cryo buffs gives him 100% crit rate. That would be too broken? No, it would not. Because in order to get the Cryo buff, it makes it a lot harder to justify putting non-Cryo or Animo elements on your team. Because if you build for the Cryo buff with really low crit rate and you don't get the Cryo buff, you do no damage. But also, Wanderer gets crit rate from a decent amount of sources already, right? So that 100 crit rate he could get is not 200 CV. In practice, it's gonna be like at best 65, 70 CV. But it is a big enough buff to make that Cryo buff preferable over the other ones. Gives him an actual reason to be played in teams with a Cryo unit over Bennett and Farina. Why not make it crit damage then? I mean, you could. Sure.
Deuce on the loose. Deuce on the loose.
Deuce on the loose.